Hey everyone, welcome to the MJL. I'm your host, Mike Lee, and I interview my everyday friends who have hidden talents beyond their regular 9 to 5 day job. Today I have Andy Wong, former colleague of mine from Jam City, but more importantly, he is the wonder wall of wordplay, a young king in comedy, and puts the hum in humor. Welcome to the pod, Andy.
I think I have some competition with wordplay with you.
I mean, I have to I learned from the best, clearly. And also, the time that we did work together, everything we always look forward to your jokes, right? No matter what. And
Oh,
funny thing is, I was talking to a former roommate of mine who also works at Jam City, and he was saying, we have like those like game all hands sort of meetings, right, where like apparently like you're presenting some data and stuff like that, and he's like, yeah, like Andy always throws that guy Andy always throws in a joke, and he makes Josh, who's like the CEO or COO, I forgot which one, and I should know, but he makes him laugh every single time, right? And I thought that was hilarious. It was just like everybody knows who you are just based off your jokes, and that you make people laugh even though they've never met
oh,
you before.
oh, thank you. Those are the kindest words you can say to like a comedian.
And that's not from me, right? That's just from like, my friend who I don't even actually really talk to like that much, overall. And he's telling me like, oh yeah, that dude Andy, right? Like the one who tells jokes all the time.
Oh, that's awesome. Like, honestly, like if this is something I experience sometimes, like very rarely, someone on stage will be like, "Oh, you're cute," but I'm like, "But am I funny?" Like, that's what I really want to know. It's like, oh no, they're
That's
just hitting
hilarious.
on me now for the wrong reasons.
Oh man, I forgot. I think I might have been listening to a comedian about uh being a comedian, and or maybe it was being a comedian being a woman, right? And it's just like there was no, I think it's Ali Wong. I think it was when one of her skits, right? She was saying like, yeah, you think being a male comedian, right? Like you get all these ladies that try to come up on you, but when you're like as a female comedian, where's that other side of the spectrum? Like it doesn't necessarily you know always come to
Yeah, it
fruition.
does translate. Yeah, you don't want the creepy guy hitting on you afterwards as a female comedian.
Exactly. Maybe if they were like, a couple drinks in, right? Like that's just a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah, I have seen that happen while they're on stage, and it is very uncomfortable for everyone.
Oh
Like,
man, that's
like
awkward.
dude, audience members hitting on like female comedians. Like, oh, come on, like, this is
All right.
gross. This is gross.
I mean, you get a whole variety of people, I imagine at these comedy shows that are there, to absorb some laughs, right? And, for there to kind of, relieve themselves from kind of everyday life.
Yeah, and it's interesting. That's like how I originally thought about bringing that into the office too. So I'm glad that your friend and colleague
Yeah.
was able to appreciate that because honestly, one of the ways I actually got into comedy was through our work. So our work had this basically career development budget, and I used that for a comedy class, which is great. And I think the ROI was positive on that from what I was able to bring to the team. And yeah, I honestly, it's one of the best experiences that I've had. I got into the game pretty late, like when I want to say when I was like 27. Yeah, 27 I got in. So a lot of comedians, they get in when they're younger, like 18, early 20s. Um, but I think the advantage of going into comedy a bit later in life is you have things to talk about because you have a lot of lived experience. Like when you're like early 20s, late teens, you have a lot of angst. But when you've lived a little, you've lived. You have shit to talk about.
That makes sense. Like, was it something that, was just a talent that you honed, right, by taking these classes? Or was it more like maybe you had a sense of humor on the side, but it wasn't as refined? Or, you mentioned you didn't necessarily have as much potentially lived experience, right? Before you were taking the class. So talk to me a little bit about, how maybe the comedy part, whether that was something that you grew up with, maybe not honed perfectly, but were there seedlings of interest, right? That eventually kind of led to that.
Yeah, I honestly I never thought about doing stand up comedy per se, like as myself. I always enjoyed the medium. One of the early ways I kind of got into it was actually through my family. My family is a Cantonese traditional family. If it wasn't basically like these Cantonese dramas out of Hong Kong, the other thing that we did was we watched this Cantonese stand up. Um, his name is I believe it's Wong in Cantonese, but he is really funny, and I think he's the only Cantonese stand up. A lot of other folks in the entertainment district, entertainment industry,
I mean, it can be a
they'll do it
district,
at like
sure, yeah,
award shows.
yeah,
Yeah, they kind of live in a
yeah.
old district. I mean, LA, right, is kind of one of them.
But
It's
yeah, I
entertainment
mean, I would
district.
just imagine like, a district like Hong Kong, right? Like kind of in the middle, like between, the handover and not the handover. So like you can have, one foot in, one foot out. I mean, it's totally fine.
Yeah. They'll do a lot of bits during award shows. That's kind of like their thing. But no one had like a specific show just to do stand up. And it's interesting. So in like Cantonese entertainment culture, a lot of singers will do funny comedy bits in between their songs, and it's expected, which is really interesting. So I think that's kind of how I ingested, and that was how I ingested it through my family. It's just like for me, it was a safe space. The family can laugh together, even if it's dirty jokes. They'll just like explain it to us. Which I was like,
That's
okay, cool.
pretty
I don't
funny.
know. Yeah, they're like, this is why this is funny. And I was like, okay, that sounds gross, but okay. Uh, but yeah, that's kind of how I got into the medium of it, and then I really got into the early Dave Chappelle's and then the English stand-ups. And interestingly enough, so my daytime job, what I've done for the majority of my career, is digital advertising. And lo and behold, I was at my office one day scrolling through Instagram, and I got a digital ad on Instagram that was like stand up course at Second City near you. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. And as the world's worst marketer, I fall for marketing tricks the
That
easiest.
is not the
So,
world's worst marketer. I even click on ads to get served to me, right? As well as a marketer, just because I'm curious what the page that I'm going to is actually going to lead to. And like I want to see how the ad actually connects to the page. So that's what I'm particularly interested in when I click on an ad. But anyways, I digress.
no, that's the right reason, I think, as a marketer to do it. I'm just easily influenced. So I saw that ad and it stuck around in my head, and then I saw it again, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna give it a shot. I'm gonna see if I can do it through my professional development, and I could, and that's how I started. It was a Second City course in Toronto. It was super fun. It was interesting though too, because a lot of famous comedians, you hear their stories, and they come from a place of extreme humbleness, right? Where they hone their craft through just doing the thing. They go out on an open mic one day, they try it, they give it a shot, they love it, they find a mentor, and they get really good. With Second City stand-up classes, because you're paying pretty hefty amount, right? It's not like something like a normal person would shell out a lot of money to do. You meet a lot of these very educated professionals who can basically afford it, which is really interesting. So I kind of like got an introduction through like a hoity-toity version
Got it. So
of
you
like
went
the
you went
stand-up.
through like the boot camp, right? Like the equivalent of like a tech boot camp, but for comedy, where it's like, oh, hey, like well, you got to pay like 13K up front, right? I'm just exaggerating, 13K up front, right, to get like you graduated from Second City, comedy, comedy school. Or if it's like, well, we'll fund you, but if you every stand up gig that you do, we want 2% of your earnings or something like that, like income share agreement to
That'd
support
be amazing.
the art.
If they wanted an income share agreement, I would be like, this is a great program, because here in Canada you do not get paid well for comedy, if at all. it's That's kind of the norm, at least in the Toronto scene that I've been in. Uh, I think the most I've been paid has been like $50 for like a 10-minute set, and I was like laughing to the
Oof,
bank. I was like,
oof.
I got paid $50.
But did you make it up with tips?
Uh, No, I made it up with feedback though, so I refined my set
Okay,
for,
okay.
for, for performing. But yeah, that was basically kind of the benchmark, and I realized then afterwards that was like the high benchmark because afterwards I started getting paid for shows, but it was like $15-$20 here and there. And then I realized if you want to basically make a living doing comedy in Toronto, you have to be an international star, and this has to be like a stop for you. Like
Okay, okay.
Toronto's like a tour destination of like 10 different cities. Then you're making money in Toronto.
But the question is, right? Like, if there are comedians that do stop by on tour, right? Do you get to be one of many potential people that gets to open for, a comedian at their show?
That's a really good question. I think, from my understanding of it, is you have to have a really good agent, and then they can try to basically get the in for you. If you're like kind of the amateur scene, such as myself, and you making your way, in that case, you're basically using different platforms to make a name of yourself so that people know who you are. It's interesting. Before, I had a lot of friends who were into visual arts, and they always talked about like exposure dollars. Have you ever hated that? And I understand it now. And thank God, like I understand it having like a day job. It's funny because a lot of like new comedians, yeah, they'll be like, "Oh, you've been doing this for a while. What's your biggest advice?" And I'm like, "Don't quit your day job." that's literally my like, don't do it.
You should tell people to use your day job as your exposure dollar mechanism, right? Because they'll probably get more exposure there working at a company, and you just have to do stand-up gigs in front of your colleagues.
That's what I did to you guys.
Exactly. You tested out all the jokes on us. I mean, granted, some of them were game-related jokes, which were very contextual. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Which helps though, because I did run a like a video game specific themed comedy show, which is I thought that was one of the best ways that I found to get into the scene and actually give yourself a platform. So I think some old comedians get a little flack because they do the old and tested way. They're like, the only way to get better is to go out and do it.
Yeah.
You got to do a lot of it. If no one's giving you stage time, get your own stage time. And a lot of like new comedians like, oh, come on, man, like you shouldn't expect that. But like I think there's a hint of truth in that, right? Like you only get better at doing the thing, but don't get conflated with busyness for productivity, right? So some people hear that and like I'll see comedians go out and do like 4 or 5 open mics a night, and I'm like with them maybe 2 or 3, but they haven't changed their set those 4 or 5 times, right? They're doing the same set 5 times, and then they think maybe at the end of the night, oh, I think I got better. I'm like, nah, you did the same shitty set 5 times.
The
You didn't
question
really
is
iterate.
whether their delivery was. I mean, there are probably some minor, improvements. Whether their actual delivery got better, right? Or that's the only. Or I guess that's the only way I could think about how you would improve it. If your set's the same all the time, is just your delivery of it.
Yeah, that would be a delivery thing, but also to be fair, it shouldn't always be the same every time. Like you should be changing your wording.
Yeah.
You should maybe have 1 or 2 punchlines if you're trying to basically do like an A/B test of how good a joke land.
Fair.
If you're just doing if you're just doing the A version 5 times in a row and think that helps you somehow, like maybe it helps you with like recovering from disaster, like, from like an ego standpoint. You're like
Yeah.
you build callous, but
I guess it's different if
I'm
like
like,
you're doing that joke in one place and then you're doing the same joke in another place. Like,
that's
because then
also
it's
true.
it's
Yeah,
as fresh,
there
right?
is. Yeah, I would say that there's something to that too, right? Because maybe that wasn't your audience. Maybe the next one's your audience. But if you do it 5 times in front of 5 different audiences and you bomb that joke 5 times, that's probably a bad joke. At which point you're not improving. You just confirmed 5 times that was bad.
So something that was interesting is I went to a Nigel Ung comedy show. He was in San
Oh,
Francisco. So obviously his persona is Uncle Roger. Hiya, walk fried
yeah.
rice fuckboy, right? Like that's kind of his like shtick. And so the interesting thing that he did was at a show he came out as in his Uncle Roger shtick, right? And basically used that to gather joke fodder, right? Like he would use this like, hey, where are you from? it's like, oh, that person's maybe from Taiwan or China. He talked about like, oh, like you're from the Philippines. Is this your dad? Did he beat you? Kind of thing, right? Like he basically took all these like, tropes, right, in the beginnings, of his set, and then when he came back, or basically gathered information, and then he came back out, right, in his non-Uncle Roger set, so his regular Nigel Ung set, and basically leveraged all of those conversations, he had before to kind of intersperse and make it a little bit more dynamic, which is something I really appreciated because I really wasn't following his like Instagram page like very very detailedly, but I was like, oh wait, all these jokes that he was saying, right, they were from already posted online, right, but it's just that now he's executing them in person. So I thought that was pretty funny, but he leveraged the tech crowd in San Francisco. So we'd be like, oh, like someone was a founder of a AI company for, I don't know, it was like men's clothing. And it was just like, can you help this man, dress better with your AI, like software? Or it's just like, you're saying like, oh, who's your co-founder? Are they Malaysian? Right? They work hard. That's why you're here. Right? Like it's stuff like obviously, right? But it's just like he's leveraging his background, and obviously he's Malaysian, like as well. So I think it seemed like he was just leveraging his background, leveraging the crowd, whether it's their ethnicity or the types of jobs they do, right? And kind of just playing everyone off of each other, maybe in kind of the Asian comedy kind of way, where it's just like, oh, you're Chinese, oh, you're Taiwan, you're Taiwanese, and saying like, well, you didn't have a virus named after you, so are you a legitimate country, right? Kind of thing. So those, I mean, it was fun. It was like it's funny. Obviously comedians will be slightly offensive, right? But there's the irony that we're all sort of laughing at.
Yeah, and I think you touch upon something I think is really important, right? Because I think the offensiveness in the irony is a lot of what comedians try to use to get folks to think about the that idea,
Yeah.
right? It's like there's a reason you're laughing at it, and there's a reason why we think it's funny. Whereas you could take it the other way and be like, I'm offended, period, which is, I understand that too, for the most part. But it's almost like if it's like I I know there are folks who think that comedians have a responsibility to do some deeper critique on society, which I think is fair. And I think with those kind of jokes, I think those are what they're trying to do, which is a lot more meaningful than what I think an actual's primary responsibility is. And that's to make you laugh, right? like I like for all the talk about what the responsibility of a comedian is, and the high ground and the morality behind it. At the end of the day, primary responsibility is to make you laugh, right? The secondary is great. It's almost like I want to say if you bought a book for entertainment, the book is supposed to entertain you.
Right.
I think that is primary, raison d'etre. But if you buy a book and it entertains you and makes you think, then I think that's a higher level of literature. And I think that's kind of the same way we should like look at comedy. It's my recent thinking about it.
I think even at the, if you want to call it the lowest levels of comedy, even with slapstick, right, or sort of high class humor, they all obviously have some irony to it, right, and they all make you think, right. It does. I think it could be lowbrow, slapstick, high class comedy. Like I think all of it is all great comedy, no matter what genre it is, will kind of make you think about it, right, and reflect upon different people's sort of situations, or whatever the setting may be. I think you're right in that there's always going to be a irony to it, but I think it depends on the audience for them to actually interpret it, for them to actually feel some attachment to it, because that's what the thing that stings the most is the thing that like makes it the most funny and the most entertaining.
Yeah, it's that double-edged sword. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dang, man. Yeah. You got to come out to my show so I get less flack.
You should just like
Oh.
honestly just like in the background just have like a big QR code and just be like, all right, pictures allowed, right? But really it's just a link to your Venmo and just like what you get people to just like, send you money. It's like you like a joke, right? Like while you're taking a picture, right? Like, just add a little bit more, add a couple more dollars here, right? Like
That's
get
amazing. That's a
get
great idea.
get paid in real time.
That's actually, I think, a great idea, to be honest. So one thing I did do, because I have the privilege of having basically a pretty good full time day job, is I produced my own comedy show, and part of that was a little bit of the old school thinking. Right, it was like I was basically trying to get more stage time. Some comedians in Toronto would book me on their shows, but I wanted like basically guaranteed stage time at least once a month for myself. So I basically emailed one of the big three comedy clubs here in Toronto. I was like, look, I want to put together a video game themed comedy show. I work in the industry. I know there's a crowd for it. I know the community. And that was kind of my in. And then now I have basically a monthly show at the Toronto Comedy Bar in Bloor, which is one of our bigger ones. And I think the ease of which I did it shocked me, in
Okay.
that more people don't do it, which is something I found interesting, because one thing comedians really value is stage time. Stage time is one of those things that, like, I want to say money can't buy, but I mean it kind of can, but usually you don't want to
Right,
show
right.
up, like pay in to perform. But yeah, to be able to basically produce a show to guarantee yourself a set amount of stage time, I think it's an amazing thing. And I think in like a lot of people's minds is like one step above what they think they're capable of. They're like, oh, I got to be a somebody to be able to produce a show. And what I realized was like, as a working professional, and nah, I mean, worst case scenario, you try and they say, no, not yet. And you're like, ah, okay, I'll come back when you're ready. But the amount of people who don't take that shot, but go out at night and put their ego on the line, their self esteem on the line over and over again. I'm like, if you can do that, you can write an email. You know what I mean? Like the barrier to entry is so low, and I think that's true of just performing comedy as well, right? The barrier to entry is so low. Like you can go up to any open mic and do a 5 minute set that you put together, but it's like who has the guts to try to do it? And I realize it's like even of the people who have the guts to put themselves out performing in front of a crowd may not have the courage to try something like produce their own show, because that level of rejection may be even more, you know meaningful than the rejection of like a 10-20 person audience. And that I think blows my mind.
So what you're saying is you don't have enough competition and you need more, right? Just because you clearly, right, like it's just there's just not enough comedians, right, to, take over Toronto.
I think there's plenty enough, but I would love to see them try, because the thing is, it's interesting because there's a weird power dynamic when you're a producer, because then now comedians who really want stage time go, hey man, what's a guy got to do to get on your show? And I'm like, you just message me like that, and maybe show me a clip of your stuff. If I don't know you, if I know you and I know your stuff, I'll probably try to put you on show if I like it. And I'm like, in order to send that message, you might as well give your own shot. And some of these folks who are messaging and reaching out to me, I know for a fact are better comedians than me, because I've been to their shows. I go to shows because they're on it. And I'm like, holy smokes. Like, if you just shot your own shot and basically did your own show, I would be there. I would be on the other side of this message. Like, and I would like encourage anyone who's trying to get into the comedy scene, shoot that shot, because you're basically shooting that shot based any night you're going out to an open mic, and there's nothing to lose.
You know that one thing that you could try. So actually, one of my friends in the Bay Area, he's volunteering for this for the Berkeley Humane Society, and he's partnering with a brewery. And this brewery
Oh,
partners with, uh, but it's a couple breweries that partner with like the Humane Society. Basically, it's like a animal adoption center, and they basically are having all you can drink for 3 hours, and obviously there will be dogs there as well. Like I think
oh,
cost is like $95 US, right, for a 3 hour all you can drink, but it has, a bunch of different breweries and stuff like that there. So I was just thinking, like, wow, Andy, you could just make the comedy version of it, right? Basically, an all you can drink, but you have, comedic sets like going out through all the whole 3 hour period. So one, you either fill out, a bar or a brewery or some specific location. You get the brewers to come, right? And when you go to a comedy club, they ask you like, hey, you need to pay for, X amount of drinks, right? Because the club's gotta
Yeah,
the club's gotta make their money back somehow. And
exactly.
so
Yeah.
maybe that's a nice idea where you just say like, all right, everyone who wants to shoot their shot, right? Like, here's the form, right? Like, basically you get the supply of your comedians, and then you just ask like, hey, like, this is for a good cause, whether it's like you're supporting local comedians, but you can also have brewers there as well for like an all you can drink kind of thing.
Yeah, I love that idea. Actually, that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
That and if you do that across some kind of time, then you can put together your own festival, which I think once again sounds like a lofty thing, but the barrier to entry is just who is willing to help you and are you willing to put yourself out there to do it.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah, that's a great idea.
that's my hot take for the comedic version of that.
Yeah, dude, I might try that in Toronto. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
So I know in Canada, right, like there's restrictions to drinking, right? Or in terms of like accessing alcohol. Like, does that apply to brewers as well? Like out there, like, I don't know how drinking
Uh,
and like the comedy scene, kind of intermingle, given that there's restrictions and stuff like that.
well, in Ontario, you just can't drink outside.
Okay, okay.
For some reason or another, that's something our government has said is somehow morally reprehensible. Is being seen publicly intoxicated and intoxicating yourself, which I mean, I guess, but sure. As long as you're in an inside venue, it's fair game. As long
Okay,
as you're like of drinking age.
got it. I would just
I
think.
would say
Go ahead.
so. Yeah, I would say one thing our Canadian government doesn't do too well outside of Quebec, which is French Canada, which they actually do well, is they do not recognize comedy as a specific type of art. So we don't get art funding per se, which is something I think the States does a lot better. Because in Canada, if you want to apply for any kind of art grant or funding to do comedy specifically, it's not actually a recognized art, so you don't have that kind of backing to other arts. You get visual arts, you have theater arts, dancing arts. Those are all recognized. Comedy or comedic arts is not a supported category. So we kind of have to try to pool ourselves under like performing arts. But it's hard to do that because now, the funding and government support that you get is basically hyper competitive against this already very competitive category. So that's one thing the Canadian government could do a bit better to support struggling comedians.
So what you're saying is the Canadian government is trying to indirectly, cancel out comedians from criticizing the government because they're not funding comedians directly, and instead of saying like, hey, we're gonna pull an authoritarian or like a censorship type move, we're just gonna cut the funding, to comedic arts, and that's what you're saying, right?
You know what? I'm gonna say that's up for interpretation. I know our prime minister's had a lot of trucks to deal with, so maybe it's just down to his priority list.
It was funny because yesterday I was watching the White House Correspondents' dinner. I don't know if you had seen that yet with Trevor Noah. So he's basically,
Oh, nice.
yeah, he's just basically talking to a bunch of, and they do this obviously. I think it's like, is it every year? I almost want to say it's either every year or once I don't know, once a term or something like that. But they have like a comedian at the White House dinner, and there's a bunch of press, celebrities, um, the White House staff, and stuff like that. And one of the things he was saying is like, thank God, you can be a comedian in the West, right? Like that it's a legitimate profession, and that you can criticize someone, a politician, openly, right, and not have to worry about you know disappearing the next day. So I feel like that's one area where, you know, being a comedian in the West, right, is definitely much more elevated than probably anywhere else in the world, because you don't have to worry about necessarily. It's a different kind of cancel. Let's just say that it's like you get xed out
Yeah.
by the government and not by, you know, the people.
Yes, yes. That's I feel you on that. Yeah, for sure, 100%. That's that's something that's I think yeah, that is a huge privilege that we enjoy here in the West is being able to do that kind of political satire and humor. It's interesting. There are some folks that I hear, you know, across seas who do comedy, and all their comedy apparently from you know from what I hear, and folks that are really into it sound very similar because there's only certain topics you know won't get you disappeared, which is mind-boggling to me, right? They're like family dynamics. What's
Yeah.
up with that? But I mean, like, you can cut that 2,000 different ways, but at some point, you might want to say something's a bit more meaningful.
I think it's just like comedy in Asia is, I would say definitely not political, because one, you're definitely going to disappear. It's
Yeah,
obviously it's a much more authoritarian, you know, type of culture, right? As well, like you're not supposed to disrespect your elders and things like that. So I think that kind of like trickles down as well. But the type of comedy is much more nuanced in terms of how they make fun of different people or different types of events, and it's not it's not straight up slander, right? Like, I mean, obviously with Asian languages, that's never ever really direct, right? It's always like kind of a beat around the bush, you know, kind of way where you kind of have to read the room, right, to really understand it. It's much more, you could say it's much more elevated, high class, you know, sort of humor that requires a lot more depth and understanding, because, you know, you probably would disappear or get canceled if you just said it out directly, or if it was like too slapstick. um, there it I think it's just, yeah, it's just way more nuanced in my opinion.
yeah, and that is something I definitely feel, especially when I write comedy. I think that was something that I had to get over quite a bit to adopt to more, I think, Western style comedy. Because for myself, I come from like a very high context um, Asian background as well. Like my mom's like a Chinese Vietnamese refugee, my dad's Cantonese immigrant from Hong Kong, and like yeah, exactly what you're saying. It's very high context, right? Like you can say a thing, but the actual thing being said is like buried 2 layers deep, and you basically have to interpret that. And for me, what I thought was funny, buried 1 layer deep. Some of my friends were like, "I don't get it. You got to spell that out for me." And I was like, "Well, isn't it obvious?" And they're like, "Well, when you explain it, it's obvious."
Right, right.
Like when you're like doing, I think stand up in the Western world, it's got to hit right away, and they got to understand at that surface level. And if they understand at one level deep level, it'll be like that, like it's almost like that, like second laugh you get. You go, ha,
Right,
ha, oh
right.
wait, ha,
That's
ha.
like the extra zinger when you hear people say ooh, right? Like that's when you
Yeah,
know, like, oh, like that one cut deep, because it goes a couple
yeah.
levels deeper.
I think some comedians do it well. I was watching Ronnie Chang's the latest special,
Yeah, the was it the
um,
speakeasy one?
the Speakeasy one,
When
yes,
the one where he tosses
and
the
he's
water at
got it.
someone, like he just picks up someone's water and tosses it
Yeah, tosses
inadvertently,
that them.
right? Like as part of his act.
Yeah, that I he had a few jokes in there that cuts 2 layers deep. But if like as a even as like because I'm very westernized myself now, as you know, my Canadian side of watching that, I'm like, ha, that was a funny joke. But then I was like, oh wait, no, I see what he's doing there. Like the second level, I'm like, ah, I think those are really cool. Um, it does suck though when like I think you do one of those, but the surface level doesn't hit. But then
Mm.
you think about it later, and you're like, oh, that's what they were saying. But then that moment has passed, so
Do
it's
you do
for
you
the
think
comedian on
okay?
stage.
Do you think that
Yeah,
it's
it's
because they're, and something I've noticed as I've watched more like Netflix, you know, comedy shows and stuff like that, is that they do a lot of story build up, right? It's like when you're going to, you know, when these big comedians, when they're doing a comedy bit, right? Like it's all narrative driven. Like you're actually just telling a comedic story throughout the whole thing versus like, all right, I'm gonna pull out, my note cards and just try out this joke, right? Like there's usually a theme, I'm guessing, to a set. And so when you were talking about, does because something didn't land initially at the first layer and then it lands later on after the joke has already passed, do you think that's partially because the storytelling and the setup and where the timing of it was relative to the setup, that maybe just didn't work out very well?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly it. And I think one thing that comedians get wrong a lot, and I think this from a marketing background from a day job, is no matter what we think, the audience is always correct, right? It's like as a marketer, I might come put together this amazing marketing plan I think is awesome. I did the research, I got the data, I put together this really what I think is a really engaging piece of advertising, and I put it in front of what I think is going to be a target audience that's this is going to resonate with, and it doesn't resonate. A lot of comedians when they do that would be like, audience sucks. Right? But as a marketer, you kind of know, well, no, because I'm the one trying to appeal to the audience. Like, if I'm not appealing to the audience, the problem is what I put in front of them, not the audience. Right. So I think that's one thing a lot of mature and experienced comedians understand, but some newer comedians like, or even intermediate comedians are like, no, that audience sucks for this thing. I'm like, no, if you're trying to appeal to that audience and it's not hitting for them, it's the thing that you're putting in front of them. Because one thing too I think has really helped in my comedy career from my daytime job is like you never get married to an idea. And I think that's very hard for some comedians because some of it really comes from the heart and lived experience. So for them, they're like, but this is funny for me. This is my story that I'm trying to tell. But I'm like, if you tell it in that way or you tell that piece of it, it might not be the best way to do it. And as a marketer, don't get too married. But for some comedians who where those things come from deep inside of them, and then they're being vulnerable on stage and it's not hitting, then it hurts extra. I can kind of feel it.
I think, and this is just my opinion, like as I would imagine as a comedian, like the good comedians are the ones who have the most third party neutral perspective on things, right? So that way they can kind of play two forces against each other without actually being, emotionally connected to either. And I feel like that's where you really find the irony in what one person's saying compared to another person or certain type of situation. And I'm sure that there is comedy that does, sort of speak to the from the heart, right? And I think there are moments for that, but I would imagine it's like a skilled comedian has to take themselves out of their own character and also jump back into themselves if they are a character. And so it's like playing two different types of, persona at one time and just giving the audience cues of when you are switching, basically switching gears.
Yeah, and I feel you on that a lot. And I think one thing that I've really adopted, I think helps me with that, is when I actually perform live on stage or whatever it is, I come in with the mentality of I am performing. So if as a performer, this is my job. And if it doesn't land as a performer, I have a job to entertain. That's how I take it. If I'm not entertained, then I'm not doing my job as a performer. It isn't, I'm not landing as basically some kind of public representative for a thing, which I mean, if you can do both of those simultaneously, that's awesome. But if you can't, primary job, right? You're entertaining. Otherwise, it's like a lot of people in the industry would be like, then you're doing a TED talk. In which case, apply
Hey,
to
a
TED.
TED talk can be entertaining at the same time, right? Like
They
I mean,
can.
yeah, it's just that the people up there, right? Like they just try to make presentations, and it's not really with the comedic angle. That's all. It's not to say that they couldn't be funny.
Yeah. I want to backtrack a bit too with like basically doing comedy with like an Asian cultural background and that context. It's interesting because I had watched a play by the daughter of a Vietnamese refugee, and she had made this play about her mom and basically how a lot of cultural values in the Vietnamese North American community um, played a role in how she passed away. and she basically told this very moving story. She acted the whole thing out. It was a single person play. I cried, my partner cried. It really hit home for us on a lot of levels. And when she did a Q&A, someone said, "How did your family react to you telling this story?" And she said, "Not well," because they're like, "Why are you airing out our laundry?"
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Like,
I've also gotten, not as a comedian, but just like as an Asian person, airing out my family's, history, or maybe you just, some people just need to vent, right? You need to explain a
yeah,
situation, but your Asian parents are like, why are you telling other people, about, the family dynamic kind of thing, which is like, because either it's bothering me, or it's like I need, to talk with other people to how do I navigate this situation. And yeah, I think it just comes down from that sort of like authoritarian top down, kind of culture. And
yeah,
respecting your elders, sort of being really exaggerated in terms of like how far someone needs to actually respect their elders, and what does respect actually mean in for different types of contexts.
yeah. No, that is really meaningful too, because that was one thing that I continue to struggle with, right? Because a lot of my comedy comes from my lived experience from basically being a child of like refugee immigrant parents. And my mom came out to one of my shows, and she did not appreciate my jokes about her at all.
Did you
Which
say my mom is also in the show? Give it up for Mama Wong, right over here, right? Like, did you acknowledge her, right? Like, so that way, like, the audience could, feel, could empathize, right? And you introduce a new dynamic.
I really wanted to. I actually did. I really wanted to, but she explicitly said, "I do not want you to do that." Which I think it does come from a little bit of that background, right? Like no one kind of wants to be spotlighted, and it's like if you're gonna talk about me, don't talk about me in front of me.
You could have
Like,
just said, "My mom is somewhere out here. I'll let you guess which one it is," right? And just don't say anything from there. So the spotlight is just widened, right, across the entire floor of older Asian women, and it can only be so many of those.
yeah, that that's great because I actually I have a show coming up that I'm producing on Mother's Day coming up
Oh
in
boy, she's gonna
in
love this.
I invited her. I I said, "Mom, it's Mother's Day. Come down to the Mother's Day show I'm putting together." And she literally said, "No, I went to your last show. I'm good."
What about
I'm
what
like,
about your
"Oh,
what about your dad? Have you taken your dad to any of your shows?
I have invited him, but he coincidentally has work every time I invite him."
Okay. You should tell him the story of Jimmy O Yang and his dad, right? I don't know if you've heard his story about how
Oh
his
yes.
dad, like, also assumed like, oh, just being a comedian, right? Like, seems like an easy job. Anybody could do it. And like, I'm sure as a comedian, it's like, no, I've worked really hard, right? I've had to go through so many skits. And then he was saying like, oh, his dad just showed up for an audition one day, and he looked like he was half asleep, and he was just worried that his dad was gonna bomb it. And then lo and behold, he did it. It was just like he did it well. See, it's not so bad, right? Like, typical Asian dad, fashion. And I think Jimmy O Yang was just like flabbergasted, right? He just couldn't believe like how well like he did it. And he was saying like that his dad was getting more shows, more callbacks like than he was, right? Like for a short period of time. And that was, I think, the most amazing thing for him.
Yeah, I love that story. I actually love that story because in a way, like I imagine Jimmy Yang thinks this way too, right? He's like so proud of his dad
Yeah.
because I think I really do think that like children are like basically the best of parts of their parents and the worst
And the
parts.
worst, yeah.
And like I get my I think I get my best parts for both my mom and my dad.
Okay.
I know like from both of them, I know they have like performing hearts. Like my dad did martial arts a lot.
Okay.
My mom did traditional Chinese dancing. Like she like performed on stage and did that for a long time too. But typical immigrant experience. Their parents didn't really support that and stuff. Um, so when I go on stage, I'm like, this is coming from somewhere. and both my parents are basically one way or another artists or performers. And I like to think if my mom had the courage to go up on stage, she would kill it. I think she would kill
There's
it.
still time. Yeah.
I'm still trying to convince her. I'm like, look, half my material is you anyways. You can shit on me for a bit.
Yeah, just change the role, right? I mean, but maybe also like they're really, maybe she just doesn't feel comfortable with the forum, right? Maybe it would just need. I mean, I don't know what like the demographic, right, of the comedy clubs are like, but maybe she just needs to go to, I don't know, like, okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, like go to a mahjong hall, and that's where she does her stand-up bit, like, oh, my son, he tells me, a bunch of, he slanders my name, right? Just hear the mahjong tiles like clanging and stuff like that. Like that's where old people gossip anyways, right? So like it just has to be the right forum for that. Like maybe she's already
Yeah.
just, making jokes about you on, I don't know, like WeChat or something like that, or some other platform.
Yeah, she'd kill it on WeChat. For real. I would, on my daytime job, I'd have to get her as an influencer or something.
Funny thing is that on my pod, and actually, this guy was actually my roommate in college. I'm not sure if you've heard of Martial Club. They are like a martial arts YouTube channel, and also they do like martial arts skits and stuff like that. And like some of them, the members were like in Shang-Chi and Everything Everywhere All at Once. So they did the fight choreography for that. But they said that a lot of their inspiration came from obviously Hong Kong cinema, which is kind of they're putting their own kind of unique spin, on that type of cinematic style of action where it's usually one pan, it doesn't cut. The way that my roommate Daniel had described it was when they cut stuff like an action movie, let's say it's like Fast and the Furious, it's like punch, cut, the other punch, cut, right? Like reaction, cut, right? Like everything is not smooth and in one shot. So he was saying how, a lot of his idols, in the Hong Kong, cinema scene, a lot of them went through like Peking Opera School and stuff like that.
Oh.
So the fact that you said your dad is a martial artist, your mom is a dancer, so basically Michelle Yeoh is like the embodiment, right, of your parents, essentially, because she
Yeah.
she was a dancer by training, and then she became a martial artist, as someone in Hong Kong trying to break into the action film genre. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
my take. You should have them go see Everything Everywhere All at Once, just because it's Michelle Yeoh's time to shine.
Yeah. I that is on my to-do list for sure. Yeah, she's definitely an inspiration because that is amazing. Like I remember watching a interview she did, right? And she talks about her dance background and how that really helped her with a martial arts background.
Yeah.
And I thought that was awesome because like I think um especially in I think the Asian community, like we segment out arts quite a bit. It's like dance is dance, martial arts is martial arts, right? And it's like written word is written word. And they all have parts that complement each other. And I think we should embrace that more. And I think we had a good step towards that with Shaolin soccer. I really do.
Okay.
Like,
Well, I don't know if
they
you
put martial
heard.
arts and soccer.
I don't know if you heard, but Kung Fu Hustle 2 is coming out.
I did not hear this. Amazing news.
Yeah,
Hell
I read
yeah.
about it recently. It was just like, I think it's like 15 years ago the first one came out, I think. So
Has it been 15 years? Holy.
so it's coming out. I don't know when. I just remember that it is coming out. They've got some promotional marketing materials already out.
That is amazing. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And I would say that that is one thing I think the Chinese community, like comedic wise, has held on to very well is their physical humor. I think is very much still alive and expanding. Whereas like I think with like Western comedy styles, it's going a lot more towards what would the word be? Clever wordplay, I
Okay.
would say. So it's taking a step away from like the Mr. Bean.
Yeah.
Whereas I think there's a lot you can do with that, and I encourage folks, like don't think that's like a lesser form. I think that's great, and I think that is a whole genre on its own. Really do.
I think part of the peaking opera stuff is also what plays into what you were talking about earlier, where you had to sing, you had to dance, right? You had to act, and you had to do it all right on stage, right? There wasn't like, hey, we're gonna get you a stunt double for the action scenes. You're not gonna swap out, right? We're not gonna swap you out or voice you over, right? Like it's literally like the Chinese version of a Broadway play, right? But I would say
Yeah,
even
I was gonna
almost
say
even,
yeah.
but also way more intense, right? Because everyone has to do their own stunts, right? There's no stunt double for everything. It's just like everything. I think in Hong Kong cinema was just very much on a budget. You didn't really have insurance policies or anything like that. Like, if there's no such thing as like maximum work hours, right? It's just like you keep filming it, you keep doing it, all that stuff, right? Until like you get it right, right? And there's just less or workers comp limitations,
Yeah.
right? In Asia, or especially specifically in China or Hong Kong for that kind of stuff. So you could say that whole process, like it's a grindhouse, right? You put your body and your soul through a lot, but like especially when you're younger, you have the ability to obviously like recover from it, but like the Jackie Chans and Michelle Yeohs and stuff like that, they're kind of a lost era, right? Because you're never really going to see all that stuff
Yeah.
like again. But you could still see probably traces of that in like I'm assuming like Chinese variety shows and stuff like that, that your parents probably sort of maybe grew up with, or like they've seen some of their favorite I don't know, actors and stuff like that, like that they've known, for a really long time, and watched that. They basically grew up with them.
Yeah. No, I feel you on that for sure. It's interesting you bring up. It's like in every interview Jackie Chan and Michelle Yeoh has done, like the interviewer will be like, so like who insures you? And every time they're like, no one wants to insure us. Because every insurance company knows that they're gonna get hurt. Because
As part,
yeah, you're
yeah,
right. They do all their own stuff. It's crazy.
yeah,
It's like you think it's like sometimes there's like camera magic, sure, but like for them, they are the magic,
yeah.
which is amazing to me.
So interesting. I don't know if you know, but for Shang-Chi, so I think Andy was Death Dealer. So his name's Andy Lee. Uh, uh, he was Death Dealer in the movie. He's part of Marshall Club, which is the group that my friend started with like two other people, Andy,
Nice.
Brian, and my friend Daniel. And my friend was saying how, or Daniel was saying how they use the Jackie Chan stunt team, right, for a lot of the Shang-Chi fight scenes. So like for example, when they're the bus, right, like you have that they're in the tunnel, right? They have the one shot, right, where they're doing all the action scenes. It's almost like a video game where you're kind of like progressing,
Yeah.
progressing through the bus, right? But it's not like they cut a lot, or cut as in like they didn't switch camera angles like that often. They kept everything kind of fluid through one scene, or when they did like the whole catch the punch in the jacket, twist it around. Like that's very, Jackie Chan, Hong Kong cinema style
Yeah.
reminiscent. So, we definitely do see where that influence is kind of trying to make its way back into Western cinema. And I'll bet like it's, shorter scenes, or like in small bits and pieces.
Yeah, but I think yeah, both. I think even like yeah, Hollywood cinema could learn a bit from that too, because it flows like what you're saying, right? The flow is better. I think when you're watching those action scenes, when you watch what's the one with Optimus Prime, Transformers.
Transformers, yeah.
When you watch a Transformers fight scene, it just looks like two giant metal robots having intercourse or something. You have no idea what's going on. Like, oh, I guess there's robot sex.
Yeah.
I guess,
But I think the thing it
but
makes
like
it
yeah, with
go ahead,
yeah.
sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say yeah, with like Shang-Chi especially, like when he threw a punch, the camera went with the punch,
Yeah,
right? It wasn't like a
exactly.
static thing, and then like the other guy got hit in the same frame. Like the camera pivots with the motion, which helps you know like, oh, where's the motion coming from? Where's the motion going? Those things I think are small things, but big impact.
I think the thing that makes it really help stand out are two things. One, it makes it seem like it's a dance, like because that's where martial arts
Yeah.
and Chinese dancing, right? They kind of intertwine, right? Like they kind of almost, essentially, you could say almost one and the same, right? But when put on a stage, right, it's almost like a dance, right? Or even like when what was it? The main character, Tony Leung, and like his, then lover, like when they were doing their fight scene, which is obviously, I think it's was it reminiscent, very reminiscent of House of Flying Daggers. I think that's the one. It was either that or
Mm.
Hero or something like that. Like it was very much a dance. Like you see them kind of like gliding, into the wind, right? They're fighting, but they're also like in love with each other. So it definitely tells like a story. So that's something one that I notice as an appreciation for. But also in the Shang-Chi fight scenes, like there's a comedic aspect to it, like because everything's shot in one thing, you could see how the props are being used, right? Someone starting from a weakened sort of, or a disadvantageous situation, right? They pick something up, right? And now they become uh they lead into a more advantageous position, and that humor of how they got there from being in a disadvantageous situation, to an advantageous situation, like that's the comedy and humor that comes from action, which you don't really see a lot of.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's something I really miss from Hong Kong cinema. Yeah, that they do that really well. Because I love how you broke that down too, right? It's like you come from a disadvantaged situation, and then like basically you use your coat, then you get a thing, then you get a stick, then you get a thing, right? And kind of build up. I love that. Yeah,
I mean,
it's
isn't that the same
I
for like comedy as well? Or like when you're a stand up, right? You're just saying, like, I don't know, for example, so I was spanked as a kid, or I was beaten up by my mom as a kid, or something like that. Like you just start off with some trope and like some traumatic, experience, and then you sort of try to build your way up, like from that.
yeah, that's a great analogy. Yeah, actually. And it's like so some comedians go like the other way, right? They're like, I'm such in such a privileged position. I don't get you. But like I mean the most of us aren't.
Right.
So yeah, it's the majority of us is like, yeah, these are the hard things that I've lived through. Like let's laugh at it together, which I think is great. And it's almost like I love how you kind of like had that like parallel to martial arts because it's I think for martial arts, especially in entertainment, people focused a lot on the martial but not on the art, which is something that Jet Li has said, right?
Yeah.
It's a balance, right? Otherwise, it'd just be like martial killing, right?
Right. Right, right.
It would be like an art factor, but like there is an art factor, and I think with comedy, right? It's like there's make me laugh, make me think, but there's a balance.
Interesting.
It's not just
That's true. Like when you said make me laugh, make me think, right? I almost parallel that to uh, in, Chinese martial arts or like East Asian martial arts. There's this concept that I talked to my friend Daniel about, and it was like you're both the scholar and the warrior, right? Like as a martial artist, right? Like you meant like, but for the most part, a lot of what we see right in Western action films are like just the action pieces of it. They've stripped out the scholarly sort of aspect to it, and the scholarly aspect to it is like the morals behind martial arts, right? Like how you should conduct yourself, when should you actually use martial arts, right? Like should you be the aggressor, when to be the aggressor, and when to be more passive, right? These are all sort of moral or emotional temperaments. So it's interesting when you said a comedian makes you laugh, right? But also makes you think, right? So in this instance, it could be the laughter is like the martial arts piece, right? Like you find something that's really
yeah,
funny, right? It gets a lot of activity, a lot of action, but then there's the introspective part of it, which is the thinking part, which was something that was a unique parallel that I was just thinking through, kind of at this moment.
yeah. I love the way you put it. That is yeah, that is beautiful because yeah, I think with all things, right? Especially if it's an art form, there is a balance, and it sounds cheesy, but I think that's true, right? Because if you're just all hacked, then you're just then it's cheap laughs, and then there's nothing
Right.
to remember.
There's also no substance, right? There's nothing that like actually makes it very grounded. So if it's just like one funny thing after another, but they're all disconnected, right? I feel like it's just kind of like you said, all hacked together, stitched together, not with any sort of design in mind.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this comedian. He's a British comedian called Jimmy Carr.
I don't.
He's one of the big ones over there, and he's very famous for like very raunchy one-liners. And he'll have like a whole hour set where he's just doing like heavy one-liner after heavy one-liner. And he was doing a interview, and even for him, he was like, "Look, for me, what I've been doing for most of my professional career is giving these fleeting moments of happiness. Like I'll give a one-liner that hits really hard, makes you laugh, but it's not going to make you think or stick with you after you leave the show. You're gonna be like, yo, I had a really good time tonight, but after you go home, that's kind of it." Even for him, and I think for someone in his position and his career and his success, to be like, I am now working on more longer form comedy where I can tell more meaningful things, and for some of that to be equally as funny and for it to stick to people. I think that was great because he is very good at doing what he does,
Mm-hmm.
and even at that level, he's like, I can do more.
Got it. Just sounds like he was born in the wrong era, to be honest. He should have just been born in the TikTok era where it's just like you have your 6 seconds of fame and like, you kind of move on to the next thing, right? Like, very, very low context type social media platforms.
Yeah, and I would love to use that as a springboard to talk about like, and I think that it's been a very heavy talk, especially with like Dave Chappelle specials coming out and everything, like how comedy should be viewed, whether or not it's a safe space or not, and with the recent Will Smith thing at the Oscars,
Right.
because when that happened, a lot of comedian friends of mine actually got scared because they thought that set a really bad precedent. Because if Will Smith can get away with it, if I'm at an open mic, I say something, trying out a shitty joke, lands the wrong way, some guy gets mad. Will Smith got away with it, so why can't I? And we're like, oh, should we be scared? And it's weird because when you're on stage, especially when it's a performance, folks are there for you. The venue is relying on you basically to run a show as a producer, even if not even as a performer, um, to basically have control of the audience. If one audience member gets out of hand, I think a lot of comedians, especially when you're performing, feel it's our responsibility to basically talk down the situation. And I think we get that a lot in the form of hecklers. Hecklers is like, they'll basically do that kind of verbal intersection, sometimes like verbal abuse while you're on stage, and it's kind of the comedian's job to shut it down. But when it gets physical, then it gets really weird, right? Because then you kind of want to keep control of things. You don't want to ruin the night, and then someone's coming on stage. You got like maybe like 2-3 seconds to react. You don't know what's happening. Most of us aren't fighters, right? That's why we're talking and not fighting. And yeah, that did scare us for a bit. That did, and I think it is getting to a point where I think us as a society have to come to some kind of common ground to say, look, we understand that these are jokes. We understand when what you're saying is not a joke, because sometimes comedians won't admit that. Because especially when you're on stage, if you're just trying something out, or if you're riffing or doing what the guy you saw do, the crowd work
Mm-hmm.
on the fly, sometimes it doesn't land. Sometimes there is no punchline. And I've been in that situation where I've like rambled. I've gotten to the point where I'm like, oh no, I got no punchline. And I think as a comedian, it's important to acknowledge that, to be like, whoops.
Yeah.
I went in a certain way. And usually audience members laugh with you because they're with you. They don't want you to fail. And I think that's one of the most awesome things about live theater or live performances in general is the audience does not want you to fail, which I think is so cool. Because when you're failing and you acknowledge it as a comedian, they'll laugh with you because they're with you. They want you to succeed because when you succeed, they laugh. They don't want to watch your burning ship because
they're not going to be laughing anymore after that. That's why it's just like, oh no, like they're there for a specific reason, or it's just like, I paid $10, right, to have a laugh, right? Like, you better keep making me laugh. Like, just get back on track.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things I think with live theater is when the performer is uncomfortable, and then you feel uncomfortable because they're uncomfortable. Because you're part of the process now, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh no. And I think as long as I think acknowledging it goes a long way. I mean, if you're just like a shitty audience member, sometimes there's nothing you can do. But I think just acknowledging like, whoops, went a step too far, or got off track.
Got it.
Usually they'll come back with you, and that's something I'm constantly trying to practice and learn. And it's not easy because you do feel like you are in command and you have to put your best foot forward. And once things go derailed, and you're like, oh no, what do I do? You do go panic. But I think with practice and just knowing that the audience is on your side, then you should be okay.
I think one thing about the whole Will Smith situation is, one, when Chris Rock took the slap, right? Like, it was actually pretty, I mean, cool, no pun intended, how normal, well, not normal, he was obviously stunned, right? Like, that this is actually happening. But to play it off as calmly and cool, right, as he did in front of obviously a live stage,
so
and
level-headed.
it was just like, he took the hit, he's stunned, he's like, wow, that actually happened. It's like, we're at the Oscars, baby, right? Like, essentially, and it was just, yeah, he just took it really calmly, and probably set a good example for comedians in terms of how you diffuse a situation just kind of in that moment, because obviously he's not expecting obviously to get hit. And even when Will Smith started heckling him, and we'll just use that in that term, I think it's the right term for that situation, he was just like, it's a joke, right? Like, and I guess I'm surprised that Will Smith, as another actor, right? Because like, like, you're in an actor, when you're with a bunch of other actors, I would just imagine, even if something is a joke or offensive, that you understand this is an actor's space. It's like, if it's like almost saying, if another comedian made a joke and they got upset, right, and they started heckling another comedian, right, like, I don't know, it's kind of weird to have it come like full circle. You're supposed to be in a safe space as actors, as part of your profession, but to kind of act as like another random member of the audience, right, that is not aware of what it's like to actually be an actor on stage, and to what you could say mess up, or say something potentially inappropriate, right? Like, he definitely did not allow for that safe space to happen, especially in an award ceremony.
Yeah, that was, yeah. I think you beautifully worded it, and yeah, kudos to Chris Rock for just rolling and keeping professional. Because if that happened to me, I think I might have freaked out. I think the only two people that have slapped me in my life are like my mom
And your dad.
Yeah, probably. I was about to say my sister. I don't even think my sister's done it. Like, shit. Like, yeah, for that to happen, I'd be flabbergasted. I think I would lose all sense of professionalism. Cause I, is this PG-13 or can I like?
Yeah, it's PG-13, or you can swear, it's fine.
So I had a bit about the Olympics, and I didn't even know how to react. It wasn't even like a physical heckle; it was a verbal one, and I was like, the Olympics were coming up. It was like, I think the Tokyo one.
Yeah.
And I said, one of our Canadian Olympians on the swim team won a gold medal when she was 16. And I asked the audience, what have you done when you were 16? And then someone yelled, suck a lot of dick. I didn't know how to react. I was just like, I don't know. There's no gold medal for that. I don't know, what do I say.
That's the joke. That's the proper response. There's no gold medal for that. I mean, maybe unless there's some $100 coins that are involved.
Yeah, I think that was one of the best heckles I've ever gotten. It was constructive, because now every time I do that joke, I say that part too. And I'm like, yo, what would the criteria be? Like, how many you can go at once, or like? But yeah, I definitely know the feeling of being flabbergasted, especially when you're on the spot. It is not a nice feeling. It is almost as bad as bombing, because if you bomb, at least you're present and when you're flabbergasted, you're almost stuck in the past,
right,
as the world moves around you, and you're like, oh no.
Like, you're in panic mode. I would imagine, like when you're flabbergasted, but you're in panic mode, but you don't have time to think, right? Of like, what is, what's like one answer that I could just use, like a trump card, like get out of jail free card, like that I could just say right now, and that'll get me out of this situation to whatever recalibrate myself.
Yeah. That's one thing I would love to ask other comedians too, is like what goes through your head when you're like bombing or like when you're like panicking. Because for me, I'm like, I spiral sometimes where I'm like, yo, you're bombing. You gotta pull him back. How do you pull him back? Oh wait, you're thinking. They can see you thinking. I wonder how stupid your face looks every now and then. Just like spiral. And I love to hear what other comedians think, because maybe they're like, man, fuck these guys or something.
Something that I learned from I forgot. I learned from someone at not at Jam City, but at another workplace, was the power of a long pause. Right? So the
Mm,
long pause, it creates this one, I think it helps reset, environment, right? And also it makes it seem like you're thinking about something very profound, even if you are flabbergasted or like, kind of blank in the head, but you just stare at that, either stare at space or stare at something, right? The long
I
pause
like that.
makes it seem like you have something very profound, and then you just move on from that. That you I would that I mean, maybe that could be a way to get out of it, is just long silence is actually
Yeah.
your friend, right? If something happens, because the crowd will start to die down a little bit, because they'll be like, oh, what's Andy gonna say, right? Like, it must be
What's next?
something.
It's gonna be
Yeah,
good.
it's gonna be good. The suspense is killing me. And it's like, well, that's it, guys, right? Like, you just that's what like that's a way to break the ice, is with long pauses and silence.
Yeah, I really like that, and that's something I've been trying to become better at, and I think a lot of comedians could be better at, is leaning into the silence. Because I think Trevor Noah put it the best. He used to be really scared of silences, until someone was like, when they're silent, that means they're listening,
It's true.
because that means they're like, okay, what? Yeah, right. It's not like they're talking with each other; they're silent, so they're waiting for you what you're gonna say next. And that you got their attention. So I'm trying to lean into that a lot more. But I would say for even myself and a lot of other comedians, silence is one of our worst enemies, because that means they're not laughing.
But I think it's silence when you're in control of that silence. That's the difference,
Yeah,
right?
when you're out of control.
Yeah. When you're inducing the silence versus like they're silent after you try to land, a specific type of joke.
Yes, that then you're just bombing. Which you can also lean into. One of my old comedy teachers was like, I lean into bombs. I want to see how far I can push it. Which makes sense, because one thing as a comedian I would say is like you really have to love the feeling, because the time to return ratio is so low. And I like to give you like uh an understanding of it. Usually when you go to open mic, you get 5 minutes, but there's probably like 20 or 30 people signed up that night. So it might the open mic might start at like 8 or 9, but like 5 minutes each. The host might do their own little thing, transition jokes. So really, it's like round up to like 6 or 7 minutes each. 30 people, you're looking at 180 minutes. Min, that's like a 3 hour open mic. And common courtesy is you try to stay for as long as you can. Like ballpark that to like an hour. So you're staying basically an hour to do 5 minutes, which is like crazy inefficient in terms of time spent and
Sure.
return. Because yeah, you're only getting that like 5 minutes of feedback, and when you do that 5 minutes, it's not like you can like click pause, take feedback notes, or whatever. You just gotta it's real time. You gotta basically make note of it as you go, and then you sit back down for another 55 minutes for other people. So it's like 5 minutes for 55 minutes for other people. The return ratio is so low, but if you love it enough, that's what you do.
I think there's two things. One, I think even though you would perform for 5 minutes, right, you get to watch other people. You get to watch other people's mistakes, right? So
Yeah.
I think the ROI is a little bit higher on that end, by watching other people's mistakes and figure out how you can incorporate it, whether you what to do or what not to do. Um, I was gonna say, I totally forgot what I was gonna say for the second part. I think it was it was more in lines with being impromptu or improvising, right? I think there are people that they just think in jokes either all the time or they have some sort of like reaction, right, to things. So like let's say for example, like when you watch Dave Chappelle, right, like he is someone who is probably thinking in jokes all the time because he knows on the spot like how to recover right immediately or just like transition into something. So I feel like there are people who are just always in that mindset. I'll give you an example. One of my friends, he's an aspiring musician, and he does nerd rapping, which is basically he talks about like anime or games or different things like that. I think he made a song about boba tea one time. And if you ask someone like who's in that profession to rap, right, it's like okay, maybe they'll ask for like here's some words, right, like that you could integrate. They'll find ways to integrate it, right, just because they're always in that mindset. And so whether it's like uh and he actually did a pretty good job actually where someone said like Super Smash Brothers or like boba tea, right, like they'll figure out different kinds of wordplay, right, to try to make it work um, even though they may not know what they're doing at the time. They just find like the right topics to contrast it against, whether it's wordplay or like the topic is obviously they put it against something that's also very ironic.
I like that. I really like that. I think, and I don't know if this may be a controversial take. Really good creativity comes with constraints.
It's true.
That's what I like to think, because it's like when you're like you can do anything, then
Yeah,
you're like the options are too many. I don't know. I don't have a framework.
you're gonna
Where do I
overthink
stop?
it.
Where do I go? Yeah. Whereas like when it's like here is the box. Do what you want within or without the box.
Yeah.
Then at least you got like some kind of thing to ground you. And I think being creative doesn't necessarily mean you have to be good with words or you have to be good with visual arts or anything. Being creative is being able to play around a set of constraints. That's kind of how I like to think about it. And when you get a set of constraints, I really think that's when folks are able to be even more creative than just anything goes. It's like, where do you go?
Right. Exactly. The pressure makes the diamond.
Exactly. Yeah. I really like that saying.
Cool.
Today I learned.
I'm glad you learned something because I'm always learning. I feel like I'm learning something from you about comedy and just kind of how it all
Oh,
works.
thank you.
I want to talk a little bit more about Asian Americans in comedy. Like you have Ronnie Chang, Aziz Ansari, Joe Coy, Ali Wong. Right, you have a lot of Asians. I mean Asian Americans, but also Asians that are coming to America, right, to kind of be able to do their stand up bits. Like what is that kind of meant to you seeing Asians in comedy, like at least from a stand-up, sort of perspective? Just because I feel like it's only been maybe I don't know, last 10 years or so, maybe 10 or even 5 to 10 years that we've seen a more proliferation of Asians in stand-up. Like before, we would maybe see like Jackie Chan, right, and more like martial arts action comedy flicks, which is a type of comedy, but not necessarily in the stand-up sort of variety. So talk to me about your thoughts about the rise of Asian Americans or Asians in the stand-up comedy scene.
Yeah, I would say it was very inspiring, especially when I got into it at first. Because I think when I got into it, Ali Wong had her second special out.
Okay,
So it
Was that
wasn't
Baby
like,
Cobra?
I think so, yeah. I'm real confused because like the first two she was both pregnant. So I forgot what the first
Okay,
one was
okay.
called. But yeah, no, she had her second stand up special out. My friends and I loved it. So and that also put the precedent out that was like, hey, this isn't a one off. This isn't like Ali Wong had one special and then we gave up on it. She had a second one, and I think around the same time, Ron Chang had come out with his special. Jim Yo Yang, I think, got signed onto um, some Netflix series, and I was like, there is a precedent for success now. They're like society is ready for these stories. the North American society is ready to accept our kind of entertainment and hear us out. And I thought that was really inspiring. And that was one of the things that kind of pushed me forward to actually try to pursue stand-up comedy as well as like a very serious thing. Because before that we had I think like Bobby Lee from Bad TV, um, and some other like very serious Asian actors. Um, oh shit, I forgot his name, but the guy from Harold and Kumar.
Like John Cho.
Yeah, John Cho. Yeah,
Okay.
he's amazing. Like we had like Bob Lee, we had John Cho. I'm probably missing a lot of others. Like, but that was like the Hollywood examples I can really think of outside of the Jackie Chan's and Jet Li's of the world. But from there on, I was like, there's a precedent for folks just listening to us orate, which is kind of what we do. And I was like, that's amazing. And I think I just finished reading this book called the Making of Asian North America.
Oh, interesting.
And I yeah, and it's really interesting on how much Asian Americans have helped shape North America as a whole, like even myself in Canada. And I think the impact of what the community has done is really meaningful. And I think the communities that have survived and now are starting to flourish finally here are also, they deserve to have their stories heard as well, outside of just my parents and my relatives, and my own lived experience. I think there are a lot of folks who have a lot of stories to tell. Like Simu's story is crazy. I don't know
Going
if you've
from
heard
like
it,
a
but
accountant to actor, taking that leap.
yeah, the fellow Torontonian. Yeah, it's and it's funny. Like from Toronto, we have this suburb called Brampton, and for some reason, we have a lot of talent come up from Brampton.
What is it about? What is it
Like,
about Brampton? Like, describe to me that area. Like, is it pretty diverse? Right? Is it there are a lot of comedy clubs there?
I wouldn't say there are a lot of comedy clubs there. There is like a really good theater there. Um, the ethnicity is predominantly, I believe, Indian. That is there. Like we call it B Town for Brown Town.
Okay.
And it's like, and then like the Chinese communities got like a Markham covered. They kind of all got their boroughs. But yeah, Brampton for some reason I think just really supports the arts, and we just got a lot of artistic talent coming out of there. Like Alisa Cara comes from there as well.
Okay.
I think I said her name right. But yeah, for whatever reason, Brampton is a huge art hub. Folks just come out of. And sorry, go back to your original question with the Asian community and the comedians that have really come out in the scene. Yeah, I think they're really inspiring and telling stories that a lot of us relate to very very well. And I'd like to be able to join and contribute to those stories. Like from mine, even though I think everyone's got their lived experience, one thing I'm learning a lot is the Asian American experience is similar to a lot of others. And I think the more I recognize that, I think the more I recognize basically people outside of privilege, our stories are very similar to one another. So it's not like the Asian North American experience is specific just to the Asian North American experience. I think a lot of Hispanic communities in North America can relate. A lot of people from the Black community in North America can relate to a lot of struggles, because I think a lot of our struggles are similar because we've been put in places of disadvantage, and outside of like the cultural specifics,
Right.
a lot of us have a lot to basically bond over, and I think that gives me a lot of hope. And that's what really drives me. When I go out to do shows, I try to have a, like what you said, a theme that's a little bit more meaningful, and I'll try to like sugar in a bit of those Jimmy Carr shitty jokes if I can.
Got it. What are kind of the main differences between the Canadian comedy scene versus like the U.S. comedy scene, in your opinion?
Ooh, okay. I have a hot take on this one. I would say the Canadian comedy scene, folks don't usually come out to a comedy club to see a specific person. If I go like, my headliner has been on CBC, has been on JFL, the Just for Last Festival, has winner of the Winnipeg Comedy Festival or whatever it is, folks will be like, cool, don't know who that is. They won't come out and see him. Whereas I think in the States, you'll be like, Ali Wong's performing, or like Dave Chappelle's gonna be here tonight. People will go to see those folks. And even in Toronto, we feel it too. Like if a Dave Chappelle or an Ali Wong or someone really big or Bobby Lee comes out here, they will actually pull crowds to see them. Whereas like local comedians who are making headways, nobody cares because they're not big in America. Is like the best way I can put it. I don't know if anyone outside of the comedy community could name like the most up and coming Canadian comedian right now. Like
I
if I
probably
were to
couldn't.
ask you,
I'm just gonna say
yeah,
flat out right now, I would not be able to answer that question.
and I'm gonna be real. I can't either. Right? And I would say those are the biggest. Like that's I think the biggest difference outside of the like government funding and support. Um, those I think would be the biggest things. And I would say just the density of the states. Y'all have some major cities.
It's true.
Where,
It's true. We do. I mean, I guess we also have like centers of places with history of having different comedians roll through those specific comedy clubs. And so when you go to comedy clubs, you see like pictures on the wall of people who were on SNL like when they were coming up or something
yeah,
like that. Or like I think in New York it's like the Apollo, right? Like there's more historical centers and places and venues for the arts. So I think there's just more of a culture and kind of mystique like to it. So I think that probably helps like the imagery of the kind of the comedian scene or comedic scene in the United States.
yeah. I always say those would be the biggest differences.
Okay, cool. Talk to me a little bit about jokes, right? Like, so when you're thinking about how to create a joke, like, give me a good anatomy. Like, and I feel like the reason why I'm asking this question is because, like, even if someone's not going to tell a joke, right? I think there's ways to, create situations of irony, right? So that they can be better communicators, right? Or better storytellers. So talk to me a little bit about the anatomy of what you think a great joke is.
Yeah, I would say the, for the most part is misdirection. And I know a lot of comedians like uh, compare that to being like a magician. Like you're basically setting up a thing and then pulling that expectation away. So you always have to have a punchline. That is the most important part, I would say. Having the anatomy of basically what we would call the setup. So you would have a thing like, I don't know, all eggs around, and then your punchline would basically to subvert the setup. And you can do that in multiple ways. All eggs around, except if you're a square chicken or something like that.
Right.
Something stupid. Um, so that's like the most simple anatomy of it is what do you call it? The premise, the setup, and then the punchline. The premise is like what is the idea of the joke. The setup is how you would convey the idea, and then the final part would be and how you're going to subvert it. That would be the most traditional way. The other ways are a very traditional writing style or any kind of communication style is like the rule of threes. So basically, you go 1, 2, subvert, or you go ridiculous, ridiculous, normal, or more commonly normal, normal, ridiculous. So I really hate it when my girlfriend calls, my mom calls, and my boyfriend calls. Right? It'd be like something stupid to basically like subvert the 1, 2, 3. Uh, those that would be like probably the second best way to analogize like the anatomy of a joke. And I think one of the most important things is the punchline is what should carry the meaning. So I think a lot of folks conflate the punchline with the vehicle, which is basically the premise and the setup. So I think that's kind of where a lot of comedians get in hot water. Their premise and their setup uses a controversial vehicle, but then their punchline is perfectly fine. It's just the time to get there to the punchline gets lost, and then someone gets stuck in between. In which case, then you're like, oh no, please either hear me out Or
Oh, you gotta
did
explain.
you hear me?
You gotta explain it,
Yeah.
or you gotta expand upon the joke. But it's just like you have to you have to climb an uphill battle, right? Because the audience is already deflated, and then you have to kind of figure out how to roll that in to something else, so that I'm guessing like if the whole thing was, the premise, like now you have to use the 1 2 3 as the premise and then lead that into another, sort of subversion. So it's just like you're just
Yeah.
regrouping that and reframing it again. And I can imagine to do that on the spot is very, very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I just told you a really shitty joke about square eggs, so this is the benchmark.
I mean, do you feel that like though comedians use very convenient truths, right, to help bridge things a little bit? Like you're talking about, for example, like round eggs, square chicken. Maybe it's I don't know, triangular hen or something like that, or triangular scrambled eggs or something like that, right? Like, not that they're all related, but you're trying to find a pattern that's like if you expand or exaggerate the definition, it's truth, right? Or if you just like, for example, we are using parts of a chicken and you were also introducing new shapes, right? So it's just like you just have to find those parallels that sort of match that. And that's the irony, like that you can kind of get away with when, let's say, if you are struggling with a joke, it's just like, oh, I have these two things in mind. How do I just stay on theme?
Yeah, that that is a lot of what we do. And I just thought about another one that you could say all these eggs around, but only if the chicken's sticking inside the box or something.
That's a farm to table
Yeah,
joke.
and yeah, yeah, no, for sure for that. And I rely on that heavily, to be honest. And I think a lot of good comedy does, because I think a lot of good comedy does rely on a common understanding. So if I have to spell everything out to you, then it's like half a lecture. Then you're like, f that. Because I've tried to do that before. I have tried to do jokes on econ because I studied econ in undergrad. I was like, I'm gonna make my degree worth it. And I went out to open mics and I'd be like, these economic jokes. And people are like, dude, what?
You
I
must
don't
have
care
really
about
liked
inflation.
the speakeasy one from Ronnie Chang, because
I did.
I think he mentions like the central limit theorem, obviously econ joke, and I thought it was like, wow, I never thought I'd hear that in a stand up comedy venue before.
I laughed so hard when he said that. Yeah, and he was like, "Yo, the p values are too big." I was like, that was great. That was honestly great. And
uh,
that was a double-layered one too, because he was talking about penises.
That's hilarious. One thing I found out was that Nigel Ung, he was actually a data scientist before he became Uncle Roger.
Oh,
So it must be
dang.
there's got to be something about being Asian, and then being either something that has to do with money. I don't know, like being an accountant. I don't know, or something with science, right? Just basically whatever your parents told you to be, a doctor, lawyer, or an accountant, right? Feel like there's a lot of angst that's being taken away, from that, and that just becomes the butt of a lot of Asian jokes. Like, when Simu was doing all the stock footage stuff, he was just like, yeah, I was actually an accountant. So obviously, well, I'm kind of paraphrasing now or just interjecting my own opinion. Just like, yeah, he knows how to play an accountant because he was one. So if you're in a stock photo, it's like, what it's like to be, I mean, obviously he's embellishing, what accountants look like, in a bright, kind of airy sort of settings, because that accountants usually kind of get the corner venue because they just look at numbers and spreadsheets all day. And
Yeah,
when it's tax season, they're stuck in a hole, right, 24/7 for like 7 days a week.
I think yeah. So some of the funniest folks I've met are like repressed professionals. I would say, and I would like say yeah. Shout out to that like second city class I was in, because they were all really funny, and it like what you were saying, a lot of them were very educated professionals, and I think there's like a correlation to that, right? It's like the more educated you are, the better you are with language, and I think that does play a part in it, because there was like a journalist in my first class, and she was killer. Like
Cool.
she was just so good with the words.
I can imagine, just because like she could exaggerate the meanings, right? Or like play it, she could play it straight, or she could, stretch it out to fit whatever nuance that, she needed.
Yeah. I would say like if you're a working professional, don't think that means that you're like a boring person. It probably means you're very not boring because you're so repressed.
I guess how has comedy and all these these comedy classes, or just your process of being a stand-up comedian, like how has that helped you in your non-comedic life, right? Whether it's like through relationships, whether it's through work, um, just every part of daily life. Like how has that really helped you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say it's really helped me in my professional career. And what I've noticed is um, I've worked office jobs basically my entire life. And what I found is folks who work office jobs have a very low benchmark for what is funny and entertaining because we're also basically bored. We're just in front of a computer all day, either like data entry, data analysis. Like you're doing mind-numbing work for the most part. So your your threshold for entertainment while you're doing that is much lower. So I basically try to bring comedy into whenever I do presentations, kind of like what your coworker and old roommate had noticed. When I introduce myself and try to network at professional events, folks appreciate I want to say the authenticity that comes with some of the humor. I think we've been trained, especially in North America, to be very professional, but I think what a lot of professionalism brings is this like veneer of of a facade, basically, right? Like this is my best foot. This is what I think you would like to see, and this is my best business voice. And I think it's fine to play the game, but at some point, everyone's kind of playing that game. So if you can be and show a little bit of yourself, but in a fun way, people really appreciate that. I really appreciate that when I go to like professional networking events, when someone is able to break the facade of like, hello, I'm here for business, 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 small talk, small talk, small talk, the weather. I'm like, okay, come on, like this is like basically scripted. I could write like an AI algo to like automate this conversation so I don't have to have it. So if any time that like you can break out of that script, I'm pleasantly surprised. And I found that like other folks have been pleasantly surprised.
I think you should definitely come out for a comedy bit in San Francisco. I mean, we're very much a tech hub. A lot of uh, tech people here. You could get away with some of those jokes. I think when I was at the Nigel Ung comedy show, and it was like maybe last week or something like that. He was like, "Oh man, you're great. All these tech jokes, they'll work here and nowhere else." And one of them was like, like you like. I think one of his jokes was like, "Oh," he asked someone, what's your favorite Excel formula?" And someone just said, "Sum." Right, and he was like, sum, that's such a basic bitch Excel formula. Like, and the crowd was just laughing. It's like you would only like really find that funny unless you're actually using it all the time.
But to be fair, that is a pretty basic pitch formula.
But it's just so funny
Come
that,
on, man, that's in the middle.
right, but that's so funny that he elevated it in that way, right? Like, because normally you wouldn't really get a lot of like Excel jokes, but by calling it a basic bitch formula, right? Like, he made it sound like it was much more sophisticated, like trashy sophisticated, um in just a new kind of premise or setting.
Yeah, I love that. I really do. I would say other times that it's come in handy has been at weddings.
Okay.
That is like the other biggest value add. If someone's like, "Hey man, you got to do a speech at a wedding," I think we've all sat through wedding speeches that we wish would end. Like, oh God, please, we get it. You're related. Like, it's just kind of what the gist of it is. But if you can make it entertaining, I think one of the best wedding speeches I ever heard was from my sister, and she basically had a pun every other sentence in her wedding speech, and it went good like a solid 5 minutes. So she had like a tight 5 with it, and I was like, "That's good."
One of my friends, his little brother, one of my friends got married. He was one of my childhood friends, and his little brother didn't prepare a speech. And his speech was essentially, I think he just framed it as, I learned what not to do for my brother. So he would just say, like, oh, yeah, my older brother didn't have good grades. I got good grades. And like, oh, my, older brother, he went to, the Caribbeans. I'm trying to go to med school, right? Like, or something like that. Right. Like, and that was like the whole shtick, right? So I think what was interesting now that I think about it is that when you obviously don't have a script, you could just think about like, what is the one theme that I would like to have as a reoccurring thing, and just stick with that the entire time. And that's like your guide. That's your guide rail. Because I think a lot of people will just overthink, like, oh god, like I have to come up with like, like what you're saying, like Jimmy Carr comes up with those one-liners every single time. Like that's really, really hard, right? And so I think that just saying this is going to be the theme, I'm going to have jokes that just center around this theme every single time, whether it's like your sister making a pun every 2 sentences, or like my friend's brother who's just like, I'm just going to downgrade him, right? Or like tear him down like as a roast, right? Like, which happens as a best man's sort of wedding. It's not surprising. But yeah, that's something that I thought was pretty interesting and funny.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's the parameters.
Yeah,
It's the
it's the
parameters.
constraints. The constraints, lead to the best results.
Yeah, the pressure makes the diamonds. That's
The
what I learned
pressure,
today.
the pressure makes the diamond. That is correct. I kind of want to start to wrap things up a little bit because I know it's pretty late over where you're at in Canada. I do have a lightning round of questions. So, first question being, if you could open for one comedian, who would you open for and why?
Oh, that is such a good question. I honestly would love to open for Ali Wong because we have the same last name.
Okay, I was I
That's
was
one of the
thinking
big
about it
reasons.
a little bit for as I was walking back, because I got some a light dinner beforehand. I was like, what questions am I going to ask Andy? I was like, oh, Ali Wong, right? Andy's last name is Wong. What if they're like what if she's just a sister from a similar mister, right? That was my like
I like that.
that was my
Yeah,
like
and,
one
and
liner joke.
her heritage too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, man. Yeah.
You can take that.
And
You
her
don't have to pay
heritage
for
is
that joke.
similar.
Just take it. Just say that you're a sister, you're a brother from, I don't know, like, or she's a sister from a similar mister.
I love that. If I ever open for Ali, I'll be like, and this joke is brought to you by Mike. This is Mike Lee. Yeah,
Cool.
I would love to open for her because her background too. Her family background is Chinese from Vietnam,
Yeah,
which is
she grew up
where
in
my
San
mom is from.
Francisco.
It's like a yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities and overlap.
Cool. Um, for your comedian, like, okay, do you have a comedian Mount Rushmore? Sorry to use an American reference. So Mount Rushmore has 4 heads, on top of a mountain. So
Ooh.
who would be your Mount Rushmore of your top comedians?
So as of right now, and I'll just say like stand-up comedians, uh, I really admire Taylor Tomlinson. I think she's like the perfect balance between like a very solid uh, set with physicality. Like when she acts, it's really on point. Um, the second one would be James Acaster. He's like a British comedian, and he had the audacity to put out a special with 4 parts, an hour each, and each has its own theme. I was like, holy smokes!
It's
The
impressive.
amount of work, yeah, and each of them are good. So I was like, dang, that I really like him. Uh, the third one, I I want to say Ali Wong. Just I think she was very groundbreaking. I know there are folks that have come before her and folks that have come after her, but I think she, for at least for myself, really broke that ground of like, oh, Asian stand-up comedians can be a thing. And she also did always be my maybe. Which
That's a great show, no matter what people say, and especially because one,
yes,
it was a lot of they filmed a lot of it in San Francisco, I know they filmed some parts. I think in Toronto as well,
I think it was
or
Vancouver or something.
Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I identified with that movie a lot because at that time I was someone who was living at home, right? And so it's just like that's actually a fairly realistic like circumstance, right? Of especially as like 'cause I grew up in San Francisco, so rents are really high. I was like, is it worth paying $3,000 just to have freedom? Or I could just live at home, save money, right? Like obviously the more practical, version of me is thinking about that. And so when I saw like Randall Park, his role is just like, oh yeah, he's, just working at home or he's living at home, doing a normal sort of job while, Ali Wong is, being a celebrity chef, or I think that was her profession, I believe.
Yeah, yeah.
um, it kind of reminded me of like, oh, this is like Ali Wong is living like the tech dream, right? Just like I can go out and have freedom, and just like I'm so good that I can come back home. But then it's like, oh, Randall Park, you're just a painter, right? Kind of still doing the same kind of stuff, and that dynamic was so funny because I sort of saw that like where. I know people in high school that have just stayed, in San Francisco like their entire lives, or didn't go off, to uh, outside of the Bay Area for college. And then, people come back, or you have new transplants, right, that aren't from the Bay Area that come in from New York, Vancouver, wherever, right? Like, and it's like a very different type of world. And the funny thing is, like, my mom actually, she was asking me about like dating. She's like, how come you can't?
I was about to ask you
Yeah,
too.
she's like, how come you're not finding anyone? I was just like, and some of my friends, like early on, this is my early 20s, like my coworkers, like, how do you date when you live at home? It's like, I don't, right? Like it took a very specific type of like person to understand what it's like to live at home and to be okay with it. And I was talking to one of my other
Yes.
friends, like two, who she was actually, funny thing, she was actually my junior prom date, but she was also living at home. We caught up one time, and I was telling her how like, oh man, like you're kind of lucky to be a girl because there's no social expectation for you to bring the guy home, right? It's always like the guy is supposed to host,
Yes.
right? And like have that freedom, and you can escape. But like, so funny thing is like my family house, it's like 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. We're all on the same floor, and like my room is next to my parents' room. So it's like, yeah, there's no like people are like, why don't you just sneak in, right? Like, why don't you sneak? One, it's on the second floor. My parents have a dog, so the moment that anyone enters in, the dog's gonna bark, right? And there's not that,
Almost strategically.
yeah, there's no like it's not like that whole like American dream scenario where it's just like, oh, you open the door, like the window, you climb up the ladder, right? Like come in, sneak out. Like there's none of that stuff. And the funny thing is like,
Yeah.
I think also my sister set a bad precedent because one time when she was in college, uh, she brought a guy over, and uh, she didn't tell my parents that they were dating, right? And I was asking my sister, I was like,
Oh.
are you gonna tell mom and dad that they're dating? And she's like, I'll get to it eventually. But she never did until like, so basically what she said is like, oh, my friend's staying over, for winter break. And then that's the part where like they found out because eventually like they were sleeping together in the same bed, right? And they tried to sneak it through, but like my
Oh.
parents, right, like my dad saw them, so like basically he had to go talk to them, right? We were walking the dog, and he was giving the Asian dad interrogation to the guy, right, saying like, hey, make sure you don't do that, but also asking like, what do you do, what do your parents do, right, like kind of stuff like that.
What are your
Right,
aspirations?
aspirations, like that whole thing. So they didn't necessarily sleep in the same bedroom, but they slept on the couch on separate couches, like to the side of each
That
other
is
or something
amazing.
like that. So that is sort of what set the precedent of like, yeah, I'm not gonna bring or sneak any girl home, right? One, just because like my sister was the guinea pig in that situation, and I saw how my parents reacted to that. So even though that was in college, after college, when Asian parents instill fear in your mind, right? Like what the limitations are of how far you should go to test it.
I would say that sometimes is the shitty part about being a younger sibling. Because if the older one sets a bad precedent, then you can't do that thing.
Yeah, but that's my younger sister, so she set the bad precedent.
It was
Like,
the younger
yeah,
sister.
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
shit.
So it's just like, oh, she set the precedent of what. Definitely, I'm not doing that anytime soon while I'm living at home, right? Because, in my
Yeah.
mind, I have the fear of like, oh, what if my parents, like, what are they gonna think about, right? Like, they'd probably just scream or yell or just be like, oh, be surprised, and that would be super embarrassing for whoever I'm dating, right? Like, it's just like your parents walk in. It's like you're a teen. It's like
Yeah.
you're a teen, right? Again, and it's just like no one wants to be in that position.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. But I love how you put it though. It's like at some point you're kind of okay with it because you're it's such a practical thing to do. And I think at some point you become friends with your parents because that's what happened to me. I moved up very late in
Yeah,
life.
I mean that's what
I was
happened.
like,
So that's what happened to me. Like my mom. Okay, so my mom is. Well, I always call her. She's like the oldest millennial. Like, because okay, so my mom has like like she didn't grow up necessarily with a lot of things. Like, so for some context, like my family, they were born in San Francisco. My grandparents immigrated here in the 1930s. Maybe I don't know what kind of Asian American history they teach in Canada, but in the United States, right? Like there's Ellis Island and there's Angel Island. So that's where my grandparents like went through, which is Angel Island on the West Coast.
mm,
So my parents were born here, and I feel like what they went through is very similar to what a lot of second generation Asian immigrants are going through right now, whether it's like your parents can't really speak right English, very well. Maybe they live in their own kind of ethnic enclaves, and so what my parents wanted was a nice suburban house, Brady Bunch life for me and my sister to do a lot of sports. Um, and so that's the kind of like experience that's like kind of my sort of like Asian American experience. And so now my mom actually has money to do things like being able to go ice skating or going to basically go out anywhere outside of Chinatown, right? And so oftentimes it would be like she'd come into my room and say like, hey Mike, do you want to go on this hike? I would kind of sometimes I'd be like, not really, right? Like I don't really feel like it. And she'd be like, oh, your dad, he doesn't like hiking. And so she would have this like very disappointed look on her face. And I was like, I have to make this calculation. All right, I don't pay any rent at home, but do I want a really sour mom for the rest of the day? And is this my like filial duty to basically hang out with my mom and go hiking and make her happy just so that I can reset the counter for when, she doesn't blow up again?
yes. Yes. I feel that so much. Yes. It's what I call the emotional rent.
The funny thing is my dad, he actually, I think it was like for Mother's Day or for her birthday. This is right before the pandemic hit. He had bought her like my sister and I like tickets to the Warriors game, and they were playing
Ooh.
against the Lakers. And so this is when LeBron James. This is the first time I think LeBron James was coming to Chase Center, the new stadium. And I asked my dad how
It
much.
was a big game
It was a
then.
big game. Yeah, they had just the Golden State Warriors had just acquired Andrew Wiggins maybe like a few days before, so we're seeing him in person, stuff like that. I asked my dad, how much the seats were. He was like, "Oh, it was $700 to $1,000 a seat." I'm like, "Wait, why did you pay so much?" Right? Like, that mom would have
Wow.
been,
One seat.
yeah, one seat. That was per, right? And there's
Oh.
four of us. I'm like, "Why did you pay so much for it?" It's like, well, I think this counts for her birthday and for Mother's Day, so I should be safe for the rest of the year. And I was like, that was his logic. I was like, you kind of went overboard on this. Even my mom was like, God, I didn't think you would pay so much for this. Like, you didn't have to. But it's like, it's so interesting to think how my parent, or especially like my dad, thinks about things, right? Or even my mom, how she thinks about things. It's like my dad is thinking very much like, how can I get her off my case? And I don't have to remember to do things for her later on because I just banked it all on this one thing for the year. So she should just be grateful.
For him, it's an investment. That's amazing. And I'm glad to hear you got to see that game. That sounds like an awesome time.
Yeah, it was a really good time. But yeah, with me and my mom, she likes to do a lot of millennial things. She likes to go to all the fancy restaurants. She is someone who, social media wise, is very savvy. So the problem
Oh,
I think that I had growing up was that my parents, okay, so imagine your parents knew how to use the internet and were also savvy with computers. So, stuff that if your parents ask, why do you need this new computer? It's like, well, I need to communicate, with my friends, right? I need it for school. They're like, my dad's like, yeah, that graphic card is, way too powerful. Like, you just need this basic bitch one, right? Something that's not as powerful. So, when you're a kid, right? Like, you maybe want to play StarCraft or you want to play Counter-Strike and that's how you want to communicate with your friends. So every time playing StarCraft or Warcraft, like my friends would be like, you're lagging. Why didn't you attack? Right? Why didn't you do this? It's like, I'm trying, but I just literally see all the graphics chugging along and my dad,
your frame rate's too low.
yeah, exactly. Or my internet also sucked too. So I guess given that this whole theme is on comedy, uh, I also had really crappy cell phone service because I live in the hills, like the hills as in um, kind of in a more naturey area within San Francisco where there's not a lot of reception. Uh, so I
Okay.
had cell phone.
I was scared you were gonna say the hills have eyes. Hills.
No, they don't have eyes. They might have coyote eyes from here, from time to time. But cell phone wise, I had no reception, and so every time when I was in high school, I would have to give out two numbers, give out my cell phone number, give out my home phone number. And I was just like, oh, I hate having to give out my home phone number
Oh,
because
home phone.
that
Yeah.
Asian parents, they're gonna gatekeep that back when we had landlines, right? And Wi-Fi on your
Yeah.
phone wasn't a thing, right? They're gonna gatekeep that phone line and be the first ones to be like, hello, who is this, right? And they'd be like, oh, especially if it's a girl, it's like, oh, I don't know, Donna, or hey, like Susie, right? Like, okay, I'll go get Michael for you, right? And then you have to stand by, right? Like the phone, right?
Yeah.
And the phone is not in your room, right? It's in the middle of the kitchen in a common
Oh,
area,
that. Yeah.
right? So it's just yeah, we talk about either homework and after that, it's not like you could talk about anything else. So it's kind of it really sucked. So imagine now if I'm interested in a girl, right? I can't have those conversations, right? Because it's in the middle of the kitchen and maybe my mom or dad are watching TV or
Or
something
you
like that.
could, and they would judge you.
Yeah, it'll just be they'll be looking from the side, right? It's not the parents have eyes and ears, right? Like they can listen. So what would happen oftentimes is I would try to call from my cell phone, right? Or someone would call me and it would go straight to voicemail. And sometimes I would end up calling too much, right? Especially let's say if there was a girl I liked, I would end up calling too much because I wouldn't know whether or not my cell phone call had actually gone through, right? Because if you lose reception, then it just goes to voicemail. So it's just oh, I'll just try again. But little did I know that maybe some of them went through and they just racked up a bunch of calls. So it might have probably made people look like, oh, this guy's definitely 100%, a creeper, or just God, this guy's so desperate. Look at all his phone calls. It's just well, I just didn't know
Oh.
if it went through, right? From my cell phone.
That's amazing. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but that's amazing.
It's on theme for this this particular episode since we're talking about comedy. Another thing too is that my dad knew how to block IPs. So if we
Oh.
were on AIM, right? He would be like, "Oh, you got bad grades. All right, we're gonna block AIM from this time to this time." So that was a huge pain in the butt because one, I'm already naturally landlocked or cell phone reception's cut off, right? He knows I'm always have this fear of oh, is my dad watching my conversations, right? Because he knows how to block my IP when I'm on AOL Instant Messenger, stuff like that. My mom knew how to text when we all got a phone. She also had AOL Instant Messenger as well, which when I went to college, It's a double-edged sword, right? Don't have to stay on long phone conversations, but it just means that she could just message you anytime, like for better or for worse,
And expects you to message
and
back. Yeah.
message you back in real time, kind of thing. Yeah, I think my mom is probably one of the most like tech savvy moms that I can think of in terms of like just staying on top of like the trends.
Legit.
She was also on Snapchat for a short period of time. Um,
Oh wow. Okay, yeah, she know her stuff.
part
I
of part of it was because my sister was going to like travel around the world, like or do like an extended break after college. My mom was like, how am I gonna stay like in touch with you, kind of thing. It's like, oh, I don't know, just Facebook Messenger me or something like that. And then eventually my sister caved in because I think she got tired of like filtering out snaps, right, and stuff like that. Because my mom was also on Snap. She's like, okay, just give my mom, the Snapchat like details and stuff like that. So yeah, like me and my sister, we've always grown up with like our mom always having some sort of oversight. So even like I'm on Twitter, my mom has Twitter. She never uses it, but she's like, "Hey, I saw that you tweeted something." It's like, "Well, I'm not. I already know. I already
It's like
know
the
it's
third level of like, yeah.
yeah." Or like Facebook, right? One time I made a post about on Facebook. I was like, "Oh, like." How people, how like on Facebook people could used to complain about especially like in college, people would just complain about their parents or something like that, just because that they weren't friends with them. But then my mom, like, she like requested to be added friends with us. It's not like we could ignore it if we went home. It's just like, I sent you this request. It's just like, oh, sorry, I didn't get it, right? Like, because that you're gonna face the consequences later, like if you don't. And this is the problem sometimes with having parents that are so savvy with technology. Uh, so
That's a trade-off. You're not the IT person,
right,
but now they track all your shit.
exactly, right. Like one time I must have made a post like, I think I was frustrated at my mom, and I posted something, and she's like, my mom was being really salty about it. She's like, see how many people didn't like your post, right? Like, like look at those
That's amazing.
reactions, right? Like, not so great, huh? Right? Like, and these are things that I feel like most Asians will not have to deal with. Like this generation of Asians will have to deal with, but I do think that later on in life, right? Like, especially like I think as a lot more second generation Asians like start to have kids, like they're gonna know all the tricks of the
Mm,
trade, right? Like because now everyone's digitally savvy, and so it's less like, yeah, there's always gonna be a place for whatever TikTok or Snapchat, but you can bet that your parents are probably gonna start saying like, hey, we'll be on those messenger channels too, right? Like for the most part, like they're gonna know because they were once, or we were once, kids that whose parents didn't have access, and we know how to get we know how to get away with it. But I'll say from my
legit.
experience, like I recognize, it's like, all right, maybe this is an exaggeration, but it's almost like I was living under like Communist Party China, right? Where it's just like you have to carefully craft your messages, right? And there's only certain channels that you can, talk shit about your parents, right? But like, you have to be
Yeah.
very specific about when you do it and what you post, right? Because you never know when your parents will be watching and seeing what you're saying.
And how you do it. You gotta word it so you have an exit.
Yeah. So yeah, that's anyways, I know I stole the spotlight from you, at least, for that specific like question. But that's
I
like
loved hearing that.
that's my general upbringing, is just like my mom and my parent or my dad, they're, well, especially more my mom, she's definitely a millennial. Like she's like, I want to go to these shows, right? She has a doggy Instagram account, like with 2,000
Oh,
followers, like, and no paid posts whatsoever. It's all organic, and like
oh, that's impressive.
her Instagram game is way better than mine. Like the stuff that she writes for a dog is like, oh, have a possum day, right? It's like, oh, it's St. Patty's Day, and she'll do all the filters and stuff like that, the stickers.
She posting puns?
She
Oh
posts
man, yeah, you gotta.
she posts in puns, but she posts in dog puns specifically for the
That's
dog account.
amazing. You gotta up your game. That's what I'm hearing.
What you're saying is I have to get a dog and also meet her at that level. But the funny thing is too,
Yeah.
she was saying she was starting to get fatigue, right, of
Oh,
social media. So like with the dog
oh,
account, right? Like because every time she'd post something, she'd get all these comments and responses. about like, oh, how is Max doing? How is Mochi doing? Basically, they're like a yellow lab and a English lab. One passed away, which was Max. So Mochi is like the main dog on the account. But my mom was like, yeah, sometimes they would send me gifts, right? Like, I think she had given like strangers like her like address to send like her work address at the time for like gifts that a lot of the other doggy moms wanted to send. And so she would get gifts from other dogs, uh, parents' accounts and stuff like that. And so she felt like this indebtedness, like, oh shoot, like, do I need to get them something, right? Like, or like,
Oh yeah.
if someone responds back, right? Do I need to respond to them back in the comments? And like, what if you have like a crap ton of comments? Like, if you don't respond, if you only respond to one, you feel like you need to respond to
Then
all
the
of them.
other ones feel like,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh no.
So my mom stopped posting as much on the doggy account just because she was like, they know, right? Like the algorithm has eyes, right? In terms of like when she posts something again, it's like, oh, you're back, everything's okay, like it's like you're alive, right? Versus like if you don't post for a while, it's like, we haven't heard from you in a while, hopefully everything's okay, like like that's how that
Aw.
community of other dog moms or dog accounts, right? It's a different type of niche and subculture. So these are things that like my mom goes through right now, and these are very millennial, almost Gen Z
Yeah.
oriented things, like managing social media accounts. Or sometimes she'll say, uh she'll talk to me about like drama like among like the friends group and stuff like that. And it'll be like, it'll
Yes.
it'll all involve social media. It's like, this person posts way too much, right? This person doesn't know how to use Facebook etiquette,
Ah,
right? Like they're posting too
the
many
petty
pictures.
high school drama.
Yeah. But these are like 60-year-old women, right? Like talking about drama, right? And it's like so funny. It was just
Amazing.
like, this person said on Facebook XYZ, or this person said this or posted this. And it's it's so funny and ironic, like at the same time, also draining a little bit too. It's just like, these are not normal well, I wouldn't say normal, these are kind of the conversations that I would hear all the time. So that's why I usually refer to my mom as like, she was my roommate, but also is like having a millennial roommate, because all the things that she does um are very so up to date in terms of like the
Yeah.
culture. uh and people sometimes are like, oh, you must be really lucky. And sometimes I am, right? And I am fortunate to have a mom that doesn't necessarily have any sort of language barriers. Like my mom speaks English like fluently. Obviously I can't speak any Chinese because of that. And so it has its pros and cons. So that's how I kind of think about my relationship with my parents, is very much of roommates, and they're basically just big millennials for the most part.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like I got a really cool mom who enjoyed my comedy shows. So if I'm ever
I think
if I'm
so.
ever in LA and San Francisco, I'm gonna hit you
All
up.
right, sounds good. I'll try to make sure to bring my mom. Just don't roast me. Just don't roast me too hard. Otherwise, your mom.
I'm roasting your mom apparently. She gave apparently.
Well, I just don't want
She
that.
can post about it on her dog account.
I know. I just don't want that situation, where you're saying when you brought your mom, right? Just like, don't mention me in the crowd, because that's basically gonna be like, that's gonna be me, right? I'm gonna go exactly
Yep.
what you went through.
Hey, here's the thing. It's not my mom. So.
All right, my last and final question is, who could you realistically bring onto this pod that you could introduce me to and would be a good fit for it?
Oh, that is such a good question. Someone who I think has a bunch of hidden talents and is and has such an interesting life, I think, is one of my friends who I also do a podcast with. I do a podcast about narrative video games. It's like video games that are very like story heavy and story driven. And his name is Rogers, and he is one of the most interesting individuals I know. He goes sailing, he does audio tech, he loves board games, he is a mixologist, So many
Whew.
things going on with this guy,
The
and
man of many talents.
and to top it off, yeah, and to top it off, he's a genuinely good person, which is so hard to find, right? 'Cause usually when you feel like, oh, this guy goes sailing, you're like, oh, it's a douche, bro. Right?
Got it. Like a preppy
But
one.
he's one nicest guy. Yeah, like a preppy douche, bro. But no, he's one of the most down to earth people I know. Such an interesting fellow. I'd highly recommend having him on.
Awesome. Awesome. We'll have to follow up with you later. And lastly, where can people find you? How can they follow your comedy journey and whatnot?
Yes. So the show I produce is called Stand Up and Sit Down Comedy. We are on Instagram and Facebook at Stand Up and Sit Down Comedy, one word. And that kind of happened through the pandemic while we were doing stand up while we were sitting down through Zoom comedy. And now we do stand up while the audience sits down. So we've evolved. And if you want to follow that narrative video game podcast I do, it's called At Watch Play Cry on Spotify and wherever find podcasts find you. And you can follow me on my personal Instagram at Andy Wong52 because 0 to 51 were taken. That's literally why.
I'm surprised you didn't choose, 88, like Andy Wong, 88 would have made your parents very
I
happy.
should have.
You can you technically can still change it if you really want to.
I like 52.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And where can they find you, Mike?
So basically, people can find me at the MJL podcast. I think that's my Twitter handle, Instagram, etc. Those are the kind of the main ones that I'm on. You can also find me on wherever you find podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, etc. My main Twitter account that I use just on a personal one is Mike Justly. That's kind of where I just post kind of everyday stuff. The MGL one is basically just to post like the more official stuff. It's just more for distribution, not necessarily for responding. But yeah, that's where people can find me. And also you can subscribe to this YouTube channel as well, which is the MGL podcast. Andy, I want to thank you for coming on to the pod. It's been really great having you. I learned a lot about comedy as well as just general storytelling overall, and wish you the best in your endeavors.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. That was fun.
All right. Thanks, guys.